I was sitting in my old recliner 3 days before Christmas when I heard the whisper that changed everything. The lights on the tree blinked lazily the same way they always had when my late wife Margaret used to fuss over them. My daughter-in-law Melissa thought I was half asleep. She leaned close to my son David and said quietly, "We'll have him moved right after Christmas. I already called Sunny Oaks. They have a bed ready." I remember keeping my breathing slow, my eyes half closed. My hands trembled a little, but not from weakness, from rage I had to swallow. David hesitated, almost whispering back, "Are you sure about this?" Melissa didn't miss a beat. "Look at him. The medication works perfectly. Once he's admitted, we'll have power of attorney. The house will finally be ours." That word, ours, echoed in my head like a siren. My home, the place Margaret and I had built with 40 years of work, turned into a prize in someone else's plan. But she had no idea I'd stopped drinking the coffee she made weeks earlier. No clue that I'd been recording every conversation for months. No sense that I'd been slowly watching her tighten a noose of her own making. If you've ever trusted someone who smiled at you while quietly destroying your life, you'll understand what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just fear, it was disbelief mixed with fury, the kind that sits heavy in your chest until you can hardly breathe. That day, I realized this wasn't confusion or aging. It was war. And I wasn't going to lose quietly. But to understand how it got this far, how a sweet cup of morning coffee became a weapon, you have to go back to the day we buried my wife. The morning after Margaret's funeral, the house felt heavier than ever. Her perfume still lingered in the hallway, the kind that clung to the curtains no matter how many windows you opened. Every cup, every picture frame, every sound reminded me of her absence. I didn't have the strength to cook or even make coffee that day. But Melissa did. She appeared at my door holding a steaming mug, wearing that soft, sympathetic smile people use when they don't know what else to say. "You need to keep your strength up, Dad," she told me, setting the cup beside my chair. "Margaret wouldn't want you skipping breakfast." It was small kind, exactly what a caring daughter-in-law might do. And for a while, I believed she cared. She started bringing me coffee every morning around 8:30, always perfectly hot, perfectly sweet, always with a reassuring pat on the shoulder before she left for work. At first, I was grateful. It's funny how grief dulls your instincts. You stop questioning kindness when your world feels so cold. But by late March, something felt off. Around 10 a.m. every day, my energy vanished like someone had flipped a switch. My thoughts blurred, my tongue felt thick, and simple words, ordinary ones, would slip away mid-sentence. When I'd try to join family dinners, I'd lose track of the conversation halfway through. My mind would stall like a car on an icy road. Melissa would gently place her hand on mine and say, "It's okay, Dad. You're just tired. It's the grief." She told everyone the same thing. "He's been confused lately," she'd explain with that same soft voice. "Since Margaret passed, he forgets things. I heard her once speaking to a neighbor. It's probably early dementia. He's almost 70. I was 69, but too drained to correct her. And when you're tired long enough, you start to doubt your own memory. Maybe I had left the stove on. Maybe I was repeating myself. Maybe this fog in my head really was just grief. That's how it happens, you know. You don't notice the small changes because they blend into your sadness. A forgotten word here, a misplaced bill there, a nap that lasts longer each day. People mean well, or at least pretend to, and before you realize it, they've built a story about you that feels true even when it isn't. The pattern became predictable. Coffee at 8:30, confusion by 10, nap by noon. Melissa started coming along to my doctor appointments, insisting it was for my own good. He's been so forgetful lately, she told Dr. Peterson. He left the burner on last week. She smiled and squeezed my shoulder like she was helping. I wanted to protest, but my mind felt like it was underwater, too slow to swim to the surface. I didn't know it then, but every gesture, every kind smile, every "Don't worry, Dad" was part of something bigger, something planned, and everyone believed her. The doctor, the neighbors, even my own son. The woman bringing me coffee each morning was slowly rewriting who I was. But at the time, I didn't see it that way. I thought I was lucky to have someone looking after me. That illusion wouldn't last long. By April, things were slipping faster than I could understand. Every morning felt like waking up in someone else's body, slow, foggy, and heavy, as if my mind was wrapped in wet wool. Melissa still brought me coffee at 8:30 sharp, smiling like she was saving my life. By 10, that same life felt like it was draining out of me. My thoughts scattered. Words I'd known forever drifted out of reach. During family dinners, I'd lose track of what people were saying. I'd sit there nodding, pretending to follow along, while Melissa filled the silence for me. "He's been so confused lately," she'd say softly, her hand resting on mine like a prop in a play. "It's the grief, poor thing. He doesn't remember things the way he used to. It started as pity, but pity can spread like mold." One day she told my son David that I'd forgotten to turn off the stove. The next week she said a neighbor had found me wandering outside in my slippers. None of it was true, but the lies were just believable enough. And people love stories that make sense. An old man losing his mind after his wife's death, that made sense. Soon, everyone started talking about my condition. The word dementia floated around like a ghost in the room. Dr. Peterson nodded along as Melissa explained my symptoms, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "He's been leaving the gas on, forgetting where he is," she told him. Then she looked at me with that tender pity that makes you feel smaller than the air around you. "Tell him about it, Dad." I tried to answer, but my mind was slow, my tongue thick. The doctor wrote something in his notes and smiled politely as if I wasn't sitting right there. I wanted to shout that I wasn't crazy, that I didn't forget anything, but the words got stuck somewhere between my brain and my mouth. That's the worst part of being gaslit, when you start to wonder if they might be right. When the people around you, the ones you trust, begin to rewrite your reality so carefully that you almost help them do it. The rumors spread quietly. Neighbors began looking at me differently. Mrs. Johnson from next door stopped chatting about her roses and started asking Melissa how I was managing. Even my brother stopped visiting. Melissa told him the noise of company upset me. She was protecting me, she said. What she was really doing was isolating me. Every visit canceled, every friendship cut off one by one, until the house that used to buzz with laughter became so quiet I could hear the clock tick in the kitchen. That's how control starts, with small, thoughtful gestures that slowly erase your independence. One cup of coffee, one gentle lie, one doctor's note that turns into a diagnosis no one questions. And then, of course, came the money. Bills I didn't remember seeing, checks that didn't add up, my pension disappearing faster than it should have. When I asked about it, Melissa smiled and said, "Medications are expensive, Dad. You're lucky we caught it early." That was the first time something inside me truly stirred. Not just fear awareness. Something was wrong, and for the first time in months, I began to wonder if the problem wasn't in my head after all. By summer, Melissa had taken control of almost every part of my life. It started small, as these things always do. One morning, David came over holding a handful of envelopes. He looked worried, almost embarrassed. "Dad, you really shouldn't be handling your bills alone anymore," he said. "Melissa found these unpaid notices on your counter." I stared at the papers in disbelief. The names, the amounts, even the account numbers looked unfamiliar. I didn't remember missing any payments. I didn't even remember seeing those envelopes before. My desk had always been tidy, every bill paid on time, every receipt filed neatly in the cabinet next to Margaret's old recipe box. Melissa stepped in, soft-spoken as ever. "We're just looking out for you," she said gently, taking the stack from David's hand. "Let us help. It's too easy to fall behind when you're not feeling well." That phrase, "when you're not feeling well," was becoming her favorite weapon. It made everything sound innocent, logical, caring. But in that moment, something about her tone felt different, like velvet wrapped around a blade. A week later, my checkbook was gone. When I asked, Melissa smiled and said she'd put it somewhere safe. My pension came in as usual, $3,200 a month from the university, but I stopped seeing where it went. The house had been paid off for years, and my monthly expenses rarely exceeded $1,800. Yet, somehow by mid-month, my balance was always near zero. When I asked about it, Melissa sighed like I was burdening her. "Medications are expensive, Dad," she explained. "Your Ambien alone costs $84 a month." That stopped me cold. Ambien, I'd never taken Ambien in my life. It was such a small lie, easy to overlook, but something about it pierced through the fog that had hung over me for months. A single word, Ambien, became the first crack in the wall she'd built around me. Still, the days blurred together. I was too tired to fight too foggy to follow the details. Melissa kept assuring everyone that she had everything under control. She started answering my phone, collecting my mail, telling friends I was resting. It all sounded so reasonable that no one questioned it. Not even David. That's the dangerous thing about manipulation. It doesn't come crashing in like a storm. It slips through the cracks as kindness. It sounds like help. It looks like love. I remember sitting on the porch one evening watching the sun dip behind the trees, trying to add up numbers in my head that no longer made sense. My money was disappearing, my independence slipping away, and the people around me didn't seem to notice. But that word Ambien kept echoing in my mind. I didn't know it yet, but it was the beginning of everything, the moment my fog started to lift and I began to see that the real danger wasn't my memory. It was the woman bringing me coffee every morning. By early fall, my world had quietly shrunk to the walls of my own house. I didn't even notice it happening at first. That's how isolation works. It creeps in, politely disguised as care. Melissa told my poker friends I wasn't feeling well. "He gets too tired these days," she said, smiling sweetly when they stopped by with chips and beer. The next week, she canceled my library book club, saying loud conversations agitated me. At first, I was embarrassed, not angry. I thought she was trying to protect me from overexerting myself. That's what she told me after all. But then, even my brother Tom stopped coming around. When I called to ask why he hesitated before saying, "Melissa told me you've been having episodes," she said it's safer to give you space. Episodes. That word hit like a stone to the chest. I hadn't had any episodes. I hadn't even been outside enough to cause one. Melissa had found the perfect rhythm of control, appear devoted in public, fabricate chaos in private. To the world, she was the selfless caregiver, the saintly daughter-in-law who sacrificed her time for an aging widower. Behind closed doors, she was quietly erasing me. The mornings all looked the same. I'd wake up groggy, drink the coffee she handed me, and drift through the hours like a ghost in my own home. By noon, I'd feel dizzy enough to nap, and by evening, I'd find out that someone else had made another decision for me, what I could eat, who I could see, where I could go. Even the small joys disappeared. She took away my crossword puzzles, claiming they frustrated me. She replaced my novels with the large print devotional books I never asked for. The radio was too loud. The television was too confusing. The truth was, I wasn't losing my memory. I was losing my voice. And it's a strange thing, realizing people have started talking about you instead of to you. One day, I overheard Melissa at the mailbox with Mrs. Johnson from next door. It's heartbreaking, she said, her tone dripping with pity. Some days he doesn't even know what year it is. Mrs. Johnson gasped softly. Oh, honey, you're doing such a good job taking care of him. I stood by the window, watching them. I wanted to shout that I wasn't confused, that I was still here, still sharp, but my throat tightened. No one would believe me anyway. The story Melissa had built was airtight. That night, when she brought my usual cup of coffee to the study, I stared at it longer than usual. The steam curled upward, sweet and innocent, but for the first time I didn't take a sip right away. My hand trembled slightly. I told her I'd drink it later and watched her expression tighten before she smiled again. When she left the room, I reached for the cup. My fingers brushed the rim and it slipped, tipping over the side of the table. The dark liquid splashed across the rug, staining it in an instant. Melissa rushed back, in her voice sharp, her face pale. Be careful, Dad, that could have burned you. I apologized, pretending it was clumsiness. But as I bent down to clean the mess, something strange happened. For the first time in months, my head felt clear. No haze, no fog, no sudden fatigue, just silence and clarity. And that's when the thought first came to me, quiet but steady. What if this isn't grief? What if this is something else entirely? I didn't know it yet, but that small accident, the spilled coffee on the rug, would become the turning point. The moment everything started to unravel. It happened by accident. One small, ordinary morning that changed everything. I had reached for my glasses and bumped the coffee cup Melissa had just set down. It tipped over, spilling across my desk and dripping onto the floor. The smell of bitter roast filled the air. Melissa rushed in, flustered but still playing her part. Be careful, Dad, she said softly, grabbing a towel. You could have burned yourself. I nodded, embarrassed, muttering that it was just clumsiness. She smiled, reassured me it was fine, and headed out again. I remember standing there, staring at the spreading stain on the rug. For the first time in months, I didn't feel tired. No dizziness, no fog creeping into my head. That's when the thought came, the kind you don't want to believe. What if it's the coffee? It sounded ridiculous, even paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the timing. The exhaustion always started about an hour after drinking it like clockwork. That day, without a sip, I stayed alert all afternoon. I even made dinner for myself for the first time since Margaret died. The next morning, I tested the theory. Melissa placed the usual mug on my desk at 8:30, same as always. I thanked her, waited until she turned away, then poured the contents into the sink. I filled the cup with tap water, sipped it, and acted normal. An hour passed. No fog, no confusion, just clarity. I repeated the same experiment the next day and the next, pretending to drink while secretly dumping the coffee. Each day I felt sharper. My thoughts stopped tripping over themselves. The world, once blurred and muffled, started to come back into focus. After a week, there was no doubt left. It wasn't grief or age or stress. Someone was drugging me slowly, consistently, and carefully enough that no one else would notice. That realization came with a flood of mixed emotions. Relief because I finally knew it wasn't my mind failing me. Terror because it meant the person behind it was not a stranger, it was the woman I'd let into my home, the one I trusted to take care of me. It's hard to describe that kind of betrayal. You expect deceit from the world, not from your own family. But I couldn't afford anger. Not yet. What I needed now wasn't confrontation, it was proof. Real proof. Something undeniable. Something that could stand up in front of my son, the police, and anyone else who doubted me. Because if Melissa was capable of poisoning me, then she was capable of far worse. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Once the fog lifted, I stopped acting like a patient and started thinking like a teacher again. For decades, I had taught literature and logic, teaching my students how to recognize patterns, lies, and motives. Now, I had to use those same lessons to save myself. I needed evidence, something solid, something undeniable. Suspicion alone wouldn't protect me. If I confronted Melissa without proof, she'd twist the story and make me look like the unstable one she'd spent months portraying. So I started documenting everything. The first step was the coffee. Each morning when she wasn't looking, I poured the contents of my mug into a clean mason jar I kept hidden behind the recliner. I sealed it, labeled the date, and stashed it away. Within a week, I had a small lineup of cloudy jars, each one a silent witness. Next, I went to Best Buy and bought an $89 digital voice recorder, cheap, discreet, and easy to hide. I slipped it into my cardigan pocket and turned it on whenever Melissa was in the room. It captured everything: her whispers on the phone, her fake concern when she thought I was too groggy to notice the small rehearsed phrases she used to make me sound helpless. What I heard on playback chilled me. She was already talking to someone about placement options at a facility called Shady Hills Memory Care. She even had dates. Secure medical opinions, finalized paperwork, file the petition after Christmas. Her voice was calm, methodical, like someone reading a to-do list. One night, while she was out at her book club, I went through her purse and found a manila folder. Inside were draft documents for power of attorney and, something worse, a pre-filled medical assessment claiming I was mentally unfit. My doctor's name was on it, but the signature wasn't quite right. She had planned it all down to the weak, fake medical records, a court order for commitment, and the house sale right after. Every part of my life was mapped out like a business deal. I remember sitting there staring at the papers under the lamplight, my heart pounding. The woman who'd been bringing me coffee every morning was planning to have me locked away. But even in that moment, I stayed calm. I'd learned long ago that panic only feeds the predator. Instead, I smiled the next morning when she handed me my cup. I acted confused just as she wanted, and as soon as she left the kitchen, I pressed record again. The recorder became my shield. Every whisper, every fake sigh, every carefully worded lie went straight into its memory. I stopped being the victim in her story and quietly became the author of my own. Still, evidence was only half the battle. I needed someone who would believe me, someone who could turn these recordings and coffee jars into legal proof. That's when I decided to find a doctor who still remembered me before all of this began. Someone who knew my real mind, not the one Melissa had invented. The next move would take courage, but it was the only way forward. It was time to bring in an ally from the medical field, someone who could help expose the truth hidden in every poisoned cup. Finding the right doctor wasn't easy. Most of them already had a version of me in their files, confused, unstable, slipping away. Melissa had built that image carefully. She made sure every appointment I went to, every test I took, every note that got written fit the story she wanted to tell. So I needed someone who knew me before all this began. Someone who could see past the fog of forged records and false kindness. That's when I remembered Dr. Clara Nguyen. She had been Margaret's oncologist years ago, sharp, honest, and no nonsense. The kind of woman who didn't let details slide. I called her office, pretending it was a routine checkup. When I arrived, she looked surprised, but genuinely pleased. "Henry?" "It's been a long time," she said, studying me for a moment. "You look good for someone who's supposed to be losing his mind." That broke the tension, and I smiled. "That's because I'm not losing it, Clara. I'm being drugged." She didn't laugh. Her expression changed instantly, the kind of stillness that comes from hearing something too serious to dismiss. I explained everything. The coffee, the fatigue, the memory lapses that vanished when I stopped drinking it. The mason jars I'd saved, each labeled with dates. She listened without interrupting, taking notes like she was preparing a case file. When I finished, she nodded once. "All right," she said, "we'll run a full toxicology panel and a cognitive assessment. I want to see what's really going on." For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't alone. The tests took hours. Memory, recall, logic exercises, reaction speed, spatial awareness, every measure of mental clarity they could throw at me. I answered each one with precision. When it was over, Dr. Nguyen leaned back in her chair and said quietly, "Henry, you're scoring in the 95th percentile for your age. There's absolutely nothing wrong with your mind." A wave of relief washed over me, not joy exactly, but something steadier like balance returning after a long stumble. "Then why do I feel so foggy after drinking my morning coffee?" I asked. "Because someone is poisoning you," she said matter-of-factly. "Let's find out what with." She drew several vials of blood and promised to have the samples analyzed privately. "If there's a sedative or hypnotic agent in your system, we'll see it," she said. "Once we have results, you'll have irrefutable evidence, something a court can't ignore." As I left her office, I felt the weight of both fear and purpose pressing against my chest. The truth was finally within reach, but the next step was just as dangerous. If Melissa was confident enough to drug me, she'd already thought about covering her tracks. I needed more than medical proof. I needed to catch her in the act. That night, I sat at my desk, looking at the jars lined up like soldiers on a shelf. The labels read like dates on a tombstone: August 2nd, August 3rd, August 4th. Each one a day of my life that she had tried to erase. I knew what had to come next. I needed eyes where hers thought there were none. The only way to expose her was to let her believe she was still winning. And so I started planning my next move, quietly, carefully, with a new kind of clarity I hadn't felt in months. Tomorrow, the house would get a new addition, one no one could see but me. A camera. The next morning, I drove to Best Buy again, this time for something even smaller than the recorder. I bought a miniature security camera, a slick little device no bigger than a golf ball. It had Wi-Fi capability, motion alerts, and enough storage to capture hours of video. The sales clerk called it smart home security. For me, it was a lifeline. When I got home, I waited until Melissa left for her weekly parent-teacher meeting. The house was quiet, filled with that faint smell of lemon cleaner she liked to use. I stood in the kitchen, studying the angles. The goal wasn't just to watch her, it was to make her feel safe enough to keep acting natural. After a few tries, I found the perfect spot tucked behind the bread box facing the coffee maker. The lens caught just enough of the counter to see her hands the mug and the bottle she always carried in her purse. Once the camera was connected to my phone, I tested the feed. Crisp image, clear sound. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator came through. That night I barely slept. My heart raced with a mix of fear and anticipation. I had the feeling you get before a storm, something big is coming, but you don't know when it'll hit. The next morning, I played the role she expected. I moved slow, acted, dazed, and mumbled a good morning greeting when she came into the kitchen. She smiled, set her purse on the counter, and began her routine. At 8:47 a.m., she started the coffee maker. At 8:49, she opened her purse, took out a small bottle, crushed 2 tablets with the back of a spoon, and stirred the white powder into my mug. At 8:52, she added a little extra cream, probably to hide the bitterness, and carried it to my study with that same practiced concern. Watching the footage later was like being punched in the gut. It was her clear as daylight, no excuses, no misunderstandings. 18 months of confusion captured in just 5 minutes of video. Over the next 2 weeks, I let the camera run every morning. Each day, the same ritual: pills, spoon, stir, smile. 18 separate recordings, each one time-stamped, each one undeniable. Around the same time, Dr. Nguyen called with my test results. Her voice was calm but edged with anger. "Henry, your blood work came back positive for zolpidem, 2.3 milligrams. That's a full therapeutic dose of Ambien taken daily." She paused. "It matches everything you've described. Someone has been drugging you for months." I thanked her quietly, though inside my pulse hammered. The blood test proved what the camera had already shown. Together, they were a blueprint of betrayal. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, the glow from my phone lighting the jars lined up on the table. Evidence. Every sip, every act, every lie she'd built her life around, now preserved forever. It was a strange kind of relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't broken. And I finally had the truth, not in words or guesses, but in images and data, something no one could twist or deny. Still, truth alone wasn't enough. Not yet. Now that I had proof, I needed a plan. And for that, I'd need more than cameras or blood tests. I'd need allies, people who understood the law as well as Melissa understood manipulation. It was time to turn evidence into action. Once the camera confirmed what the blood tests had already shown, I knew it was time to stop just collecting evidence and start protecting it. Proof means nothing if it disappears. Melissa thought she had turned me into a confused old man. In reality, she'd created the perfect cover for my investigation. Every night after she went to bed, I sat at my kitchen table, under the dim light, organizing everything like a prosecutor prepping for trial. Mason jars labeled with dates lined one side. On the other, a neat stack of printouts, blood work from Dr. Nguyen, full toxicology panels, screenshots of bank statements, and still frames from the hidden camera video. My phone buzzed every time the camera recorded her stirring powder into my coffee. Each clip was downloaded, backed up, and cataloged. I made multiple copies of everything. One complete set went into a sealed manila envelope at my safe deposit box at the bank. Another went to my attorney, Margaret Hill, a woman I trusted because she'd helped Margaret and me with our estate planning years ago. I even wrote a letter to go with the files explaining everything in plain words, the poisoning, the forged medical reports, the plan to have me committed the sale of my home. If anything happens to me, the letter began, open this envelope and call the police. As I sealed the envelope, a strange calm came over me. For the first time, I felt like I had regained some control over my own life. Melissa might still think she was running the show, but the truth was now locked away in places she couldn't touch. The next morning, I went back to my performance. Slow steps, blank stares, mumbled sentences. I let my head droop at the breakfast table and pretended not to hear when she whispered on the phone. She believed the fog had returned. She believed the drugs were still working. That was exactly what I wanted, because the only way to finish this was to let her feel safe enough to keep digging her own hole. And while she thought she was winning, I was already setting the stage for the final act, one where her lies would collapse under the weight of her own words. By the time the appointment with Dr. Raymond Ellis came around, I had everything I needed. The blood tests, the video footage, the recordings, even the timeline of her lies. But proof alone wasn't enough. I needed Melissa to finish the story herself right in front of a witness she trusted. That meant one last performance. The morning of the appointment, I did something that went against every instinct in my body. I drank the coffee, every drop. I knew exactly what was in it, the same crushed white powder that had kept me half conscious for months, but this time I needed the symptoms to return. If I showed up sharp and alert, Melissa would know her plan had failed. If I showed up foggy and confused, she'd relax, confident that everything was falling into place. Within an hour, the drug hit me like a wave. My body felt heavy, my thoughts slow. It was a strange thing willingly walking back into the haze I'd fought so hard to escape. But I reminded myself this wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Melissa drove me to the clinic, talking softly the entire way, painting herself once again as the worried caregiver. He's been worse lately, she told Dr. Ellis as soon as we entered his office. He forgets what day it is, repeats himself. Sometimes gets aggressive when we try to help. Her voice trembled at all the right moments. If I hadn't lived through it, I might have believed her too. I let my head droop, eyes half closed, hands shaken slightly in my lap. When Dr. Ellis asked me what month it was, I stared blankly at the wall. "It's June," I mumbled. Melissa gently corrected me, smiling sadly. "It's December, Dad." She turned to the doctor and sighed. "See what I mean?" The doctor nodded, jotting something down in his chart. He didn't even look at me. He didn't question her story. He didn't ask how long this had been happening. He just saw what he expected to see, an old man slipping away. For 20 minutes I played my part. I stumbled over my words, repeated simple phrases, asked where we were. Each time I could feel the recorder in my jacket pocket humming quietly, capturing every fabricated word that left her mouth. When Melissa added that I'd thrown a coffee mug at her during one of my fits, Dr. Ellis frowned sympathetically and wrote it down. That was when I realized just how dangerous misplaced trust could be. One lazy doctor's signature could have ended my freedom. One careless diagnosis could have made her lies official. Eventually, Dr. Ellis closed his notepad and said what she'd been waiting to hear. It appears your father-in-law is showing signs of moderate to severe cognitive decline. I'll prepare the documentation for memory care placement. Melissa smiled, faintly, relief flooding her face. Thank you, doctor, she said. We just want what's best for him. That line, we just want what's best for him, almost made me laugh. The act was flawless. She really believed she'd won. Later that evening, as she and David celebrated over dinner, I transferred the recording from my pocket to my laptop. Every lie, every fake tear, every professional endorsement of her story, all of it preserved in crystal clear audio. I uploaded copies to the cloud and sent one to my attorney, Margaret Hill, along with a simple message: this is the confirmation she needed to bury herself. Then I reached out to Detective Laura Burns at the Minneapolis Police Department, an investigator Margaret had once mentioned when dealing with elder abuse cases. I have something you'll want to hear, I told her. Melissa had spent 18 months turning fiction into fact. But now the truth had its own voice, hers, and soon it would be loud enough for everyone to hear. The night after the appointment with Dr. Ellis, I sat at my desk listening to the recordings again. Melissa's voice filled the room smooth, confident, certain that she'd won. I replayed her words until I could hear them without flinching. Each sentence was another nail in her own coffin, but I knew sound alone wouldn't be enough. I needed the law to hear it too. That's when I called Detective Laura Burns. My attorney, Margaret Hill, had mentioned her once, a woman who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation cases. When she answered, her tone was brisk but kind. "Tell me what's happening," she said. I didn't hold back. I told her about the poisoned coffee, the forged reports, the fake diagnosis, the plan to have me institutionalized. I sent her the files, the photos, the video clips, and the audio recordings. I expected skepticism. Most people didn't believe stories like this. But Detective Burns didn't hesitate. "Mr. Walker," she said, "this is one of the most comprehensive abuse cases I've seen. But we need her to cross the line in real time. Once she tries to profit from this, we can arrest her immediately." Her words sparked an idea. Melissa's entire scheme revolved around selling my house. It was the prize at the end of her long con. What if the final sale itself became her trap? Together, we built a plan. My lawyer, Margaret, created a shell company under the name Summit Properties, a fake development firm that would buy my house from under me. The paperwork would look legitimate. The bank transfers would look real. Melissa would believe she was cashing in her victory. I remember how calm I felt as we finalized the details. It was almost surreal watching everything flip upside down. For so long, I'd been the one trapped, drugged, silenced, cornered. Now, she was the one walking blind into a setup built on her own greed. Detective Burns asked me to hold steady through Christmas. "Let her think everything's still on track," she said. "Once the sale closes, she'll expose herself completely. We'll move in right after." So that's what I did. I played the role perfectly, the dazed old man grateful for her care, too lost to notice the real estate form she left lying on the counter. She even bragged to a friend on the phone that the deal would close on December 29th. I sat in my recliner pretending to nap while every word was quietly recorded. Christmas was 4 days away and the house smelled like pine and cinnamon, just like the years when Margaret was still alive. But this year, something darker hung in the air. Melissa was humming carols not out of joy, but because she thought she was days away from becoming a millionaire. She had no idea the buyer waiting to sign those papers was really my lawyer, no idea that Detective Burns had already secured the arrest warrant, no idea that her entire future was about to be rewritten. I'd spent months pretending to be powerless, but now every move was deliberate. Every word was measured. Because in just a few days on Christmas morning, the truth would finally come out in front of everyone she'd deceived. And this time I wouldn't need to say much at all. The evidence would speak louder than anything I could ever say. Christmas morning came quiet and cold, the kind that carries the weight of everything you've survived. The house smelled of pine cinnamon and deception. Melissa was humming softly in the kitchen, moving with a lightness that only greed could give. To her, the game was over. She had won. I sat in my recliner, pretending to sip the coffee she'd just handed me, though most of it ended up in the same potted plant that had been dying for weeks. From the living room window, I could see David and my grandson Ethan walking up the driveway with bright smiles and wrapped boxes. For a few moments, it almost looked like the Christmases we used to have before suspicion and poison replaced trust and warmth. Ethan hugged me carefully like I was made of glass. "Mom says you're not feeling so good," he whispered. "I'm feeling better than I have in months," I told him. That made Melissa's head snap her hand, but she quickly masked her surprise with a forced smile. "He has his clear days," she explained to David using that same patient tone she'd perfected. "They come and go." We opened gifts, made small talk, and laughed at things that didn't matter. But underneath it all, there was a current of tension, quiet and waiting. Melissa kept checking her watch. She had a script to follow, a performance to deliver. At 11:30, she made her move. "David," she said softly, "can we talk for a minute? In private?" I followed them, quietly, staying near the kitchen doorway where they couldn't see me. Her voice lowered into that familiar whisper she used when she wanted to sound noble. "Your father had another episode this week," she began. "He wandered outside in his pajamas at 2 in the morning. Mrs. Green from next door had to call me. Every word was a lie delivered like a prayer." She pulled out the papers from her bag, commitment forms for Shady Hills, a copy of Dr. Ellis's diagnosis, and a proposal to sell the house to cover care expenses. She played her role flawlessly, even adding a sympathetic sigh between phrases. "He's not safe on his own anymore," she said. "We have to act before something terrible happens." That was my cue. I stepped into the kitchen doorway, my voice steady. "What terrible thing are you planning this time, Melissa?" She froze. David looked startled. "Dad, you should be resting," she said quickly, her tone soft, but her eyes hard. I held up the small recorder I'd kept hidden in my pocket. "You've done enough talking for both of us," I said, pressing play. Her voice filled the kitchen, calm and calculating. "Once he's committed, we can visit twice a year and play the grieving family. The court will thank us for taking such good care of poor, confused Henry." David's face went pale. "Melissa, what is that?" "It's fake," she stammered. "He's confused again. He—" But before she could finish, I played another clip, her laughing about how the pills worked perfectly, how she'd crush them each morning while pretending to care. Then came the video. On my phone screen, crystal clear, she appeared in her robe, stirring crushed tablets into my coffee, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. David staggered back like he'd been struck. "You've been drugging him, David. Listen to me," she said, voice trembling now. It's not what it looks like, but it was exactly what it looked like. I laid the rest of the evidence on the table. The blood test results, the forged reports, the fake invoices, the real estate papers she'd hidden. 18 months of lies spread out like a map of her betrayal. She went pale, her voice breaking into excuses that made less and less sense. I was trying to help him. He needed structure. The money was for us. David shook his head slowly, the weight of realization sinking in. For us? You were selling my father's house. You were stealing his life. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ethan peeked into the kitchen, confused by the tension. "Why is Mom crying?" he asked. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because, son," I said softly, "sometimes people tell lies so big they forget who they are." Melissa looked at me, then not with guilt, but with fury, the kind that comes from being cornered. "You think this proves anything?" she hissed. "No one will believe a senile old man outside a car door shut, right on time." Through the frosted window, I saw Detective Burns step out of an unmarked vehicle parked at the curb, 2 officers behind her. I gave a small nod toward the door. Within moments, the sound of footsteps echoed on the porch. Melissa's final act was about to begin, but this time she wasn't the one directing it. The sound of the knock came sharp and deliberate, slicing through the tension like a final chord. Melissa froze mid-breath, her eyes darting to the front window. David turned toward the door, uncertain, while I simply exhaled the kind of breath you hold for months without realizing it. Detective Laura Burns stood on the porch, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Calm, steady, composed, she carried the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice. When I opened the door, she gave me a slight nod, the kind of acknowledgement that said, "We made it." "Good morning, Mr. Walker," she said, stepping inside. Her tone was polite but firm. "We're ready to proceed." Melissa backed away as the officers entered. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaken between fear and disbelief. "David, tell them your father is confused. He's been making up stories." Detective Burns didn't even look at her right away. She opened a folder crisp and organized the product of weeks of quiet coordination. "Melissa Walker," she said clearly, "you are under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit unlawful commitment." The room fell silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards under her boots. "That's ridiculous," Melissa snapped. "He's sick. He's delusional. You can't take my word out of context." Burns met her gaze with cool precision. "We've reviewed 18 months of evidence, including video footage of you crushing pills into his coffee, audio recordings of your conversations about committing him, and medical documentation confirming deliberate poisoning." She gestured to one of the officers who began photographing the table. The jars, the papers, the signed documents, each piece now cataloged as proof of her deceit. Melissa's voice rose sharp and desperate. "This is taken out of context. I was trying to protect him." One of the officers held up a printed transcript from my recorder. Her voice echoed faintly as he read aloud, "Once he's committed, we can visit twice a year and play the grieving family." David's face went ashen. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair as if trying to erase what he'd just heard. "You said you were helping him," he whispered. "You said he was getting worse." Detective Burns turned to him gently. "You're not under investigation, Mr. Walker. It's clear from the evidence you were misled." Melissa tried to move toward him, pleading now. "David, please." But the officer beside her reached for the handcuffs. The metallic click echoed through the house like punctuation on a story long overdue. When they read her rights, she tried one last attempt at control. "You'll regret this," she hissed at me. "You can't take care of yourself. You need me." I looked at her not with anger, not even pity, just the calm that comes when the truth finally stands on its own. "The only thing I needed," I said quietly, "was for you to stop poisoning me." Detective Burns guided her out the front door. The winter air swept in cold and clean. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the house felt like mine again. Before leaving, Burns turned back to me. "The power of attorney she forged is officially void," she said. "The house sale has been canceled. Summit Properties transaction was never real. It's already been neutralized through the court." I nodded, relief sinking in slowly. "Good," I said. "Let's make sure nothing like this ever happens again." She smiled faintly. "That's up to you now." As the patrol car pulled away, red and blue lights flashing against the snow, I stood at the window watching the reflection fade. There was no satisfaction in seeing her go, only closure. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't roar. It settles. The quiet after it is what you remember most, that deep, steady calm when the world starts making sense again. And in that silence, I made a promise to myself that the rest of my story wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about rebuilding, about doing something good with what was almost stolen from me. The next chapter wouldn't start with anger. It would start with grace. The house was quiet again, stripped of the chaos that had filled it for months. For the first time, the walls didn't feel like they were listening. The scent of pine and cinnamon still lingered faintly from Christmas morning, a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. But instead of bitterness, I felt something gentler, relief, maybe even gratitude. A week after Melissa's arrest, I met with my lawyer, Margaret Hill, in her office downtown. The case was airtight. Every forged document, every video clip, every toxicology report had been authenticated and logged into evidence. The court had officially voided the fraudulent sale. The house was mine again, clean and untangled from her deception. Margaret looked across her desk and asked, "What do you want to do with it now, Henry?" I stared out her window for a long moment. Snow was falling over the city, covering the streets in quiet white. That house had been my life's work. Every paycheck, every repair, every nail hammered by my own hands. It was also where I lost my wife, Margaret Walker, and where my world almost collapsed. "I don't want to sell it," I finally said. "Not for profit, not after everything it's seen." She nodded, waiting. "I want to donate it," I continued, "to the Alzheimer's Foundation in Margaret's name. She always wanted to help people who were losing their memories. Seems fitting that our home helps protect someone else's." Margaret smiled softly, the kind of smile that carries both admiration and sadness. "That's a beautiful decision," she said. The paperwork took days to complete, but I didn't mind. When I signed the final deed transfer, it felt like setting something free, not just a house, but the burden it carried. The foundation planned to sell the property and use the proceeds for research and family support programs. They promised to name a scholarship after her. By the end of January, I had packed my belongings into neat labeled boxes. Most of what I owned fit into the back of my son's truck. My new home was at Sunrise Manor, an independent living community not far from downtown. The name alone felt like a promise, a new start after a long, dark season. The place was warm and bright, full of people my age who had their own stories of loss and survival. There were poker nights, book clubs, even a garden program I signed up for. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing. I was living. Sometimes I'd walk the garden paths at sunset and think about how close I'd come to being silenced and how easily trust can become a weapon in the wrong hands. But I also thought about how many people never get the chance to tell their stories, or worse, never realize what's happening until it's too late. That's why I decided to share mine, not out of revenge, but out of warning. Because abuse doesn't always look like bruises or shouting. Sometimes it sounds like a soft voice saying, "I'm just helping." Sometimes it hides in the routines you stop questioning the coffee. You didn't pour yourself the checkbook. You stopped balancing the stories told about you when you're not in the room. The house is gone now, but its memory isn't. In its place stands something better, a legacy of awareness, love, and maybe even redemption. Next month, there's a court hearing for Melissa. I'll be there, not because I need to see her punished, but because I wanted to see the truth stand on its own. Margaret used to say that forgiveness isn't letting someone off the hook, it's just refusing to carry their sins on your back anymore. As I look out the window of Sunrise Manor, watching the first light of morning spill across the snow, I finally understand what she meant. The past can't be undone, but it can be transformed, and sometimes that's the closest thing to peace we ever get. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The kind of cold that doesn't come from the air, but from the weight of what's about to happen. Melissa sat across the aisle, hands folded tightly in her lap, wearing the same careful expression she'd worn during those 18 months of deceit, the polite mask of someone who still believed she could talk her way out of anything. Judge Williams entered, her voice calm and measured as she read the charges aloud. Fraud, forgery, elder abuse, conspiracy. Each word landed like a stone hit in water, rippling through the quiet room, leaving echoes in their wake. Melissa's public defender tried to frame it as a misguided attempt at care. He talked about stress, grief, and poor judgment. But there was no disguising what she'd done. The videos, the recordings, the forged documents, they told the story better than I ever could. When the judge finally spoke, her tone carried no anger, only the weight of truth. "Mrs. Walker," she said, "you systematically poisoned a vulnerable man, stole his savings, and tried to have him institutionalized for your own financial gain. This was not care. This was cruelty." The sentence came down like a gavel strike to the soul. 4 years in state prison, $50,000 in restitution, permanent loss of custody of her son Ethan. Melissa's composure cracked for the first time. Her shoulders shook, but no tears came. I didn't feel satisfaction, only the quiet ache of seeing what greed can do to a person. David sat beside me, silent, his hands clasped tightly together. When the session ended, he finally whispered, "I don't know who I was married to anymore." "Neither do I," said softly. He filed for divorce that week, gaining full custody of Ethan. The boy now spends his days at school, his evenings at my apartment at Sunrise Manor. We read together at night the same way I used to with his father when he was small. Sometimes Ethan asks why his mother isn't coming home. I tell him the truth gently, because children deserve the truth more than they deserve comfort and lies. She made some very bad choices, I say, and now she has to make them right. He always nods thoughtfully, then asks if we can keep reading. Books, it seems, are the best way to heal. They hold the words we can't always say out loud. Melissa will serve her sentence at Hennepin County Correctional. She'll be eligible for parole in 3 years, though I'm not sure what life she'll return to when she gets out. The money she stole is being repaid piece by piece through court-ordered restitution. The Florida condo she dreamed of has already been repossessed. As for me, I've started something new. I volunteer twice a week with the Alzheimer's Foundation, the same organization that now owns my old house. I speak to families about protecting themselves, about paying attention to the small details that can save their lives. I tell them my story, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's ordinary, and that's what makes it dangerous. Evil rarely looks like a stranger at the door. It looks like someone pouring your morning coffee with a smile. At night, I sit by the window in my little apartment writing in the journal Margaret gave me on our 40th anniversary. I used to write lesson plans in it. Now it's filled with reflections, small notes on forgiveness, memory, and the strange peace that comes after truth has finally done its work. Some pages are hard to write, others come easily, especially the ones about Ethan. He reminds me that life goes on, that even after betrayal there's room for trust again. Melissa took nearly everything from me, but in a way she also gave me something unexpected: clarity. I used to think growing old meant losing pieces of yourself. Now I know it can also mean rediscovering the ones that matter most. And so each night before I close my notebook, I write the same line at the bottom of the page. A small reminder, simple but honest. The past took my peace. The truth gave it back. It's been months since the trial, and life has settled into something that finally feels like peace. At Sunrise Manor, my mornings start with sunlight spilling across the window and the smell of fresh coffee I brew myself, black, simple, honest. I still pause sometimes before taking that first sip, but then I smile. Some habits fade slowly, especially when they've been tied to fear. Ethan visits after school 3 times a week. We sit by the pond and feed the ducks or play cards in the community room where laughter echoes off the walls. He's 11 now, curious, quick, and too kind for his own good. One evening, after I'd beaten him at poker, he asked Grandpa, "How do you know when someone's lying?" I told him the truth. You don't always, but you can pay attention to what they do when no one's watching. He nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. Children see more than we give them credit for. I teach him small things: how to make his own breakfast, how to double-check his math, how to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Because honesty isn't just about words. It's about living in a way that doesn't need hiding. I spend my afternoons volunteering at the Alzheimer's Foundation, talking to families who are walking through the same shadows I once did. Some of them come in exhausted, doubting their instincts, ashamed that they didn't notice the signs sooner. I tell them what I learned the hard way, that love and caution can coexist, and that being alert doesn't mean being afraid. Elder abuse doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it smiles, brings you dinner, and calls itself help. But awareness, quiet, steady. Awareness is the best defense we have. At night, when I sit down to write in my journal, I can still hear Margaret's voice in the back of my mind, calm and reassuring. She always believed that the best revenge wasn't anger or punishment. It was simply living well. And she was right. My health is steady. My mind is clear. The house I once feared losing now funds research that protects other families. The grandson I almost lost too lies now, knows that truth matters more than comfort. Some nights I walk the hallways of Sunrise Manor past the soft chatter of neighbors and the low hum of televisions, and I think about how fragile and beautiful clarity can be. It doesn't come from perfection, it comes from survival, from facing what tried to break you and choosing to stay open anyway. If you're listening to this, maybe it's because you know someone like me, or maybe you are someone like me trying to make sense of a betrayal that should never have happened. My advice is simple: stay aware, trust your gut, and don't mistake silence for safety. And if this story meant something to you, share it. Someone out there might need the warning. Help protect the ones who raised us, who taught us what love and trust should mean. And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the next twist isn't in a story, it's in real life.